Hello. So after we created the contact and we completed the data source, and now we need to incorporate the data source into the table view controller and provide the table view controller with the information needed to display the list. Back to Xcode, we added the data source to our AddressBook table view controller, which is the controller of the table view that we have here in the storyboard. So before we go back to the details of the controller, let's spend some time to recognize what we have here in the table view controller. As I mentioned earlier in the previous video, there are three layers at least. The table view controller, and you can see it in the top area here. It says this is the controller. If I bring in the document outliner, you can also see it from here. So this is the table view controller, and this is an invisible area that just represent the connection between that screen and the controller. If I click here where it says the table view, you see the selection now is on the table view, and you can see here a table view. So the table view controller, inside it has a table view. And the table view also can have a custom class. Currently it is managed by the library UI table view. If you click on the table view itself, if we go to the attributes, it contains the cells. And there are two types of cells, dynamic cells and static cells. The static cells, and let me switch to static cells here so you can see, the static cell are the cells where you know the exact number of rows at the start, so the rows do not change with the data. The dynamic cells, you provide a prototype cell, and here it's setting, you provide a prototype cell, and all the rows are created based on that prototype cell. So the table view is where you decide what type of table view you should have. You're gonna have a dynamic one or a static one. In this example, we have a dynamic table view, dynamic cell. So we have only one prototype, and you need a prototype cell based on the design of your cell. So if you have multiple ways the cell should look like, then you can have more than one prototype. In my case here, we have an address book, so every row will have the same information but about different people. So the cell for every row will look exactly the same as each other. So this is why I have one prototype cell. So the table view have cells, so that has the table view cell, and the table view cell will have what we call identifier. The identifier is required. It's a string that gives it a name so that you can reuse and reproduce that cell for every data item. So we'll give this cell an identifier, and we're gonna call it the contact cell. Make a reference of that identifier because we're gonna need that when we generate the content of that cell. The style of the cell, you can make your own style or you can use one of the existing ones. So a style is basically what components on the cell. So let's go with the basic style and see what happens. So when I selected the basic style, it added one label. Notice the content view here is now false and it has a title label. So the custom style added a label to the view of the cell. Let me show you this again. If I switch to custom cell, now the cell contains a view, content view. This is the one that's being highlighted here. And the content view is like a view. See here in the attributes or the identity, it's a UI view. It is similar to the views that we have used before, which means you can put on the view any of the objects that we have used before. You can put a label, a button, a control, a text field, an image, a slider, a switch, any of the controls that we have used before on a view. When the view was representing the entire screen, we can still use here, even though the view now just represents one cell. It's just a smaller view, but it's still a view. So the cell can be custom, which means you put on the view whatever you want. Can be basic, which is a cell with a title, or it can be the right detail, which is a cell with two titles, one called the title and one called detail, and they are laid out the way you see it here. Or you can do a left detail, which laid out a little bit differently, or you can do subtitle, which again laid out a little bit differently. You can select each one of those labels and change the font size for any of them, and font size, font color, and so on. So let's maybe make this, instead of make it blue instead of black, and make the details maybe red instead of the black. So I changed the properties of these two labels. You can add your own label and make your own custom cell. But what I've done here, I've used I selected an identifier called contact cell to be used for the cell. I chose the style, one of the existing styles that has two labels. And the way I want to display my address book is I'm going to put the last name in the title and the first name in the subtitle, in the details. So I'll put here last name, and then this is the first name. You can choose to add accessory to the cell, which give you the mark on the side, which is a button or an image. You can choose to change the color for the cell when it is selected, and there are multiple other options that you can specify for the cell. The table view also has multiple options. So if you want to create a separator, if you want to select multiple cells or just a single cell, we're going to do a single cell here. And the index row, there are different things here that you can look at and learn about when you review the table view. So now that we set up the cell, gave it a name, gave it an identifier, and we have two labels, one title and one detail, we can then switch back to the address book and feed the table view controller with the data to display these rows. So we added the data source, and the data source currently has a collection of one sample item. So we say the number of sections in the table view. The table view can have multiple sections. So we'll say just one section. How many rows? As many rows as we have in the data source. Then the method or the function that's called, that it's a table view function that takes a table view and has a parameter which is a cellForRowAtIndexPath. This function, which receives the index path and returns a table view cell, this function creates the cell for every index path. The index path has the section number and the row number, very similar to the picker view when it had the component and the row. So let's uncomment that method, that function, cellForRowAtIndexPath. So I remove the comment from the before the method and remove from the end. So now I commented, which means that I'm implementing that function. So that function has already this row which calls on one of the functions in the table view. So it receives the table view. The function DQReusable cell with identifier for the index path, it basically regenerates a cell based on the cell that's already identified with our identifier. So we identified our cell with the name contact cell. If you remember, back in the storyboard, we named our cell in the identifier contact cell. And this identifier will show in the table view cell. So make sure that the cell is selected. So you can see it in the content outliner, and you can see it in the tab, and you can see it in the attribute. If you selected the table view or the controller or the content view, that's not going to show. So you have to select the cell to see the identifier. So contact cell, and it's case sensitive, so whatever you type there is what you type here. And the index path has the index. So now, before the cell, so this will generate a cell similar to that cell, meaning that a cell that has two labels. Now I need to put the data in these two labels. So what would be my data? I need to get a contact at that particular index, and then use the first name for the detail and the last name for the title, or whatever other arrangement that you want. So in configuring the cell, I need to retrieve a contact at the specified index. So the index path has a row property or attribute that give you the actual row that we're trying to generate. Since we're only using one section, the row is the most important feature. So we can create a contact. So I'm going to call it cell contact equal. And then go to the data source and say, give me a contact at index. Remember, this is why we added this. And the contact at index will need an index. So we'll say use the index path and use the row property of the index path to retrieve an index. So that gives me the index of a contact. And this is the label that I used when we created the contact source. You see, we used a label, and you can label the different parameters or arguments so you can know what you're looking for. So that gives me a contact. Now that we have a contact, I can set the label for the cell. So the cell has a title label, a text label. So the text label, that is the title, and it is a label. If you remember the labels from project 1 and project 2, the label has a property called the text, but the label has optional properties. So you can either retrieve the label and use the exclamation mark, or hit enter and allow the use of the question mark here, which basically say that this text label can be null, can be nothing. But I know it is not null because we added it to the cell. And we say assign to the text property, and this is the label, so we'll say the cell contact. The cell contact is the one that holds the contact that I retrieved at that particular index, and retrieve the last name property from it. So this line is saying assign the last name property from the contact I retrieved at the particular row that we're trying to generate the cell for. Assign this to the text property of the label that's in the cell. Now for the other cell, we'll say the detail text label. And again, this has an optional, so I can either retrieve it in its own variable or memory location and use the exclamation mark to bind it with my local variable, or I can access the property after using the question mark here and say this is the text property equal the cell contact, and now this time we're using the first name property. So assign the first name of the contact at that index. This function, similar to the picker view, what happens, the operating system generates the table. So it comes to the first cell. It comes here first to figure out how many sections. Then it comes here for each section to figure out how many rows. Now for every row at every section is going to call this function to get what the cell looked like. And we in this function, you can create the cell in any way you want, but this is more efficient to dequeue the cell, meaning generate a cell out of an existing one to speed up the process, and based on this cell prototype, because this is dynamic cell, the table cells are generated when the app is working, not static at design time, as we might see later. So that's all. So now we run the project, and if everything works well, we have one sample contact, and we should be able to see that sample contact in the list of table, in the table view. And if we have an issue, then we'll try to figure it out. So here is the simulator. It takes a few moments in the first time you run the simulator, but then when you stop the project and run it again, it doesn't take that long. And if it took longer than expected, you can stop and run again. There are two steps happening here. The simulator is launching, and then your app is launching inside the simulator. So when you stop, you're stopping the app, letting the simulator comes by itself, and then the app will come. So we are having an error to run the app, so let's try again. And I don't know, this is my first time to get that error. So maybe we'll close it and try again. So here is our app, but it's coming. This is our table, and the table is not showing anything. So we should have at least one sample, but we don't have anything. So this is the init, and it added the sample contact, and in the address book we launched that. So let's see if the data source comes back. Maybe I can put a breakpoint here on the count to see if the count comes. So the section 0, and here is the data source in the table view. So this is the self data source, and the contact has one value, and this is the it is a contact value. So that is correct. So we should be able to see one contact. So we can put here, I'll put a breakpoint here, and we'll see the contact. So this is the cell contact, and it has information. And this is the cell, and the cell has a text label. And here is the name is showing up here in the beginning, as you can see. The last name and the first name as we designed them to be. So back to our planning. So that concludes our iteration number 2. We created the data source. We displayed the list in the table view, and we have the list there. So that so then we prepare to go back in our planning. That completes iteration number 2, and we start with iteration number 3, where we add a new contact to the table.